Duncan, it's my pleasure to welcome you here today, and thank you for giving up your time. I've read your CV. Well, it wasn't all of it, I'm sure. I don't think I've ever met anyone who's got 7 degrees before. You must have been tempted to remain an academic instead of becoming a grubby businessman. And I hope we'll explain that, we'll explore that throughout this session. We've got some interesting questions which have appeared for our members today. And I like the line that you use in your CV, that your family taught you that business can be an engine for good. And so often in the world today, business is regarded as being corrupt and terribly damaging to the environment, and just a total waste of time, and just a bad influence on the world. And I hope you will be able to explain that that's not actually the case, and there are people, good people like us, who take business seriously and want to do things sustainably and ethically. And we're looking very much forward to your presentation. And to be an Anglican priest as well is, you're a brave man, I would say. So welcome.
Great. Well, thank you so much, David, for that introduction. And it's a great joy to be with everybody here today, as well as being a priest in the Church of England. And I'm not sure which of the brave bit of that is, whether it's being the priest or being a Church of England. I couldn't work out. But also the other bit is I also run a business, which is a sustainability strategy consultancy as well. So I wear these 2 hats, thinking about responsible business and sustainable business, and thinking, of course, about faith in the parish and also the wider global context. And so today, in our 12 or so minutes together, where I'm going to be sharing some reflections with you, I wanted to start by thinking about this title, which I gave out as being as wise as serpents, creating sustainable business. Now, many of you will know the allusion to Matthew chapter 10, so be wise as serpents and innocent as doves. And I'm going to come back to that as we wrap up today. But I'd like us to start by thinking about what it might mean to be a sustainable business. We hear the word sustainability a lot, and I was chatting to Ken just before the start of this session. He was saying, well, he talks to lots of businesses about sustainability, but traditionally he means sustainability in the financial sense. Does this business, is it viable in the long term? And of course, when I use the word sustainable business, there's an aspect of that that's absolutely true. You can't be green if you're in the red is the sort of flippant way of putting that, but it's true. You can only have an impact if people are consuming your goods or services, if you have a viable business to employ people. So that's absolutely critical. But perhaps we can start by thinking about the definition of a sustainable business. I'm delighted to come back to this and unpack it. It's an idiosyncratic personal definition based on my work in this area. So here it goes. A sustainable business is one that's in balance with the world, could trade indefinitely with the resources we have. So that's obviously talking about the environmental constraints, but noticing that trade indefinitely. Sustainable business is one that keeps trading, that people it touches flourish. That's everybody that it comes into contact with, employees, customers, those in the supply chain. And it's supported by a system that enables the business to endure. And that last point is, of course, out with the control of any single business. But a sustainable business is one that seeks to create and support systems and is supported by a system that enables businesses to endure. In truth, I'm not sure there are any truly sustainable businesses that exist under that definition. But of course, that's what we're trying to work towards, those of us who are in business and care about these things, and in my professional identity, advising often very big businesses how they might get closer to this vision of being a sustainable business. So if we're thinking about creating sustainable businesses, and if we're thinking about it from a Christian perspective, I'd like to unpack 3 elements. The first is looking at sustainability and ethics. The second is thinking about sustainability and purpose. And the third aspect is thinking about sustainable businesses and the unique contribution that as Christians we might have to play. So let's start by looking at ethics. I know this is a topic familiar to many in faith and business. Ethics as a philosophical approach has a number of different schools of thought. So there is a behavioral school, so virtue ethics. How do we behave is the key question for ethicists in that context. There are outcome-driven questions of ethics, like utilitarianism. What's the greatest outcome that we can create? And then there's a duty-based approach, like Kant's categorical imperative, a set of duties that we have to one another. So ethics has this big, broad terrain. In truth, business ethics, in my experience, is primarily focused on behavior and process, with outcome very much as a secondary aspect. And of course, the reason for that is that behavioral economics and business economics, business ethics, apologies, is thinking about what can you control. And when you're in business, we all know it's much harder to control outcomes, particularly from an ethical perspective, than it is to control processes and behaviors. But this is different from sustainability, because sustainability is primarily concerned with outcomes. It's the impact in the world, it's the impact businesses have on people, on communities, and on the planet that's the primary focus. And so we see here this slight tension between business ethics, focused on behavior and process, and sustainability, focused on outcome. And so immediately you can find yourself having two slightly different debates, sometimes complementary, but not necessarily. Ethics, of course, also has this incredibly long-term heritage. So whether it is back to Greek philosophers, the great religious traditions, or more recently, the development of notions of business ethics, professional ethics, it has its astonishing heritage. Sustainability is a much younger approach to business, a much younger strategic framework for thinking about businesses. So you might frame business ethics as this wise grandmother and sustainability, the enthusiastic but immature recent graduate. And so we have again this slight tension between the accumulated wisdom in business ethics and sustainability, which is really trying to find its way and seeking to find models and underpinnings and approaches to business that people can learn from. So it's clear that you can have businesses that are both unethical and their actions be unsustainable. So let's take an example of Volkswagen and Dieselgate, which I suspect we're all familiar with. In this instance, Volkswagen cheats the regulatory system. That is unethical. The implications of that lie is that the world has got more pollutants in it because of Volkswagen and its stable of brands of cars are more polluting to the world. So often, of course, there's a correlation with activity being unethical and also bad for the world and therefore unsustainable. But if we look at a different category of companies, and I think a really good example here are the big tech companies. If we look at Amazon and we look at Microsoft, you can see that from a sustainability perspective, particularly in the case of environmental impacts, they are absolutely leading the way now. Microsoft and Amazon's climate change commitments are absolutely astonishing. However, when we think about them from a business ethics perspective, there are real questions to be asked for a company like Amazon around their treatment of workers, Apple and Facebook, their use of data, or their market domination and monopoly powers, which of course the European Union and the federal government in America is looking at. And so you can see how these questions of ethics and sustainability can get cut up in a business, and that can often be extremely unhelpful. And sometimes that's because different groups of people are asking these questions. But certainly in our practice and engaging with businesses, we try and see these as two interrelated aspects. Are you behaving in a way that is ethical, establishing processes that make it most likely that virtuous action and the right action is going to be undertaken, while simultaneously thinking about positive outcomes? So that's a whistle-stop tour of thinking about how sustainable business and ethics might come together. Now let's have a think about sustainable business and purpose. It's absolutely clear that you can have companies talking about a purpose that makes no kind of difference at all to really anything meaningful in the world. I mean, that's just spin and language that's just put out there. But there are companies that have a clear purpose that's meaningful to that organization. It drives and motivates commercial success, but there's no necessary connection to the world beyond that of commercial success. So let me give you some examples here. So Google historically has talked about their purpose being to organize the world's information, to make it universally accessible and useful. Well, there is obviously some social benefit to that in the way that they are talking about it, but is it explicitly positive for the world? Not necessarily. JetBlue, one of America's largest airlines, their purpose is to inspire humanity, both in the air and on the ground. Again, there's nothing explicit about that that means it has to be positive for the social impacts. This sense of inspiration might be much more a sense of their customers feeling great about their experience of JetBlue, not necessarily that they go beyond the customer to think about those in the supply chain or the communities that they're serving. One of the world's largest coffee companies, JDE Peet's, talks about unleashing the possibilities of coffee and tea. Well, wonderful, but one's left asking the question, what are the possibilities of coffee and tea? Clearly you drink them, but is that good or is that bad? Or frankly, is that just something that is ethically indifferent? Now we know, particularly those who run smaller family businesses, you don't need to have a purpose slogan to be purpose-led. It's absolutely possible to have a purpose-led and purposeful business where you're not codifying this, particularly in smaller businesses. It's lived out every day in the way you interact with people, the way the leadership speaks to others in the organization. So this very powerful sense of the purpose is just lived and breathed. But I think we can say that it is possible to talk about purpose in a business context from a marketing point of view, from a core strategy perspective, and to leave behind something of the sustainable business. And an organization I would draw your attention to, if you're interested in exploring this interconnection between purpose and business, is Blueprint for Better Business. Some of you may well be familiar with them. Charles Wookey runs that organization, absolutely fantastic organization. In its inception, had a strong rooting in social Catholic teaching, and so infused with the wisdom of that tradition. And Charles said to me the other day, as we were chatting, that a FTSE CEO had told him when it came to a purpose, he gave him this great quote, and he said, "The great prize of a purpose-led business is that people feel they're a valued member of a winning team on a worthwhile mission." So that sense of treating people really well, winning together, and this worthwhile mission. But what might a worthwhile mission actually be? And this is where Blueprint sets out 5 principles. And the principles they set out, I think, are worth noting. They talk about being honest and fair with customers and suppliers. They say you need to be a good citizen. Now that obviously is a broad concept, but I think we can understand it. A guardian for future generations. So clearly the implication that what the business does today has impacts down the generations. A responsible and responsive employer. And finally, has a purpose that delivers long-term sustainable performance. So we're back to that earlier conversation that Ken and I were having about sustainable performance being part of what it is to lead a purpose-led business. So that's Blueprint's vision for having a purpose-led business, which I found very appealing. And you can see that if we take a few examples from companies, that there are organizations that set out with a clear purpose in mind, but actually when it gets lived out, it really has some negative consequences. An example, I think, for me, and we've seen it covered in the media recently, is Brewdog. Phenomenal story of success with the Scottish brewers there. Massive growth, this kind of cheeky atmosphere, this purpose of seeking to kind of democratize craft ale and beer. But actually at the heart of that organization, something went really quite wrong, and this toxic culture developed. They've been fined by the Advertising Standards Agency twice now for adverts that are putting out things that are untrue. So even though you can be a clear purpose-led business, you need to be aware that your purpose is not too narrow and not blinding you to other issues. Wonderful business we've had the privilege of working with in America, Chick-fil-A, Christian family business in the South, fabulous in terms of treating their own people well, fabulous in terms of care for communities, fabulous in terms of philanthropy, but they struggle with environmental issues because it's not something which they have understood as being their purpose, which explicitly states glorifying God within it. A positive example that I just adore in the UK is Timpsons. I think Timpsons are just one of those great corporate citizens that think so carefully about how you do business. And they, for me, an example of a business that gets together sustainable business practices and purpose-led business in a really powerful way. And perhaps it's no surprise that it remains a family business, and the Timpson family really lead that so brilliantly. So in our last few minutes together, let's move on to think about whether Christians have a distinctive role in creating sustainable businesses. That slightly wider quote from Matthew 10 is this: I'm sending you out like sheep into the midst of wolves, so be wise as serpents, as innocent as doves. I love those three elements of being sent out, called to do something, wise as serpents and innocent as doves. Come on to that in just a moment. But the Christian impact on sustainable businesses is really mixed, actually. So let's look at some of those negatives, and then let's finish on the real positives where Christians, I think, can make this incredible positive view. So the negatives first. When you get a Christian tradition that has this real narrative focus on souls to heavens, not on creation or bodies, that can create a tension, because the planet and our physical selves can get diminished in that view. You can have this very narrow focus on people as the pinnacle of God's creation, and not a wider sense of planet. You can have a dominion view of creation, and that can have impacts on how we treat and steward creation. You can have some from the left who have a stronger view, an objection to profit-making activities of business. That's a different kind of criticism of sustainable businesses, more that critique of the place of business in society. And then, of course, in some quarters, there has been a suspicion of science and the wisdom that science has to offer the world. And of course, much of what I've been touching on is underpinned by empirical evidence and science. So when we think about the gifts that God gives us as Christians, what might be 7 gifts that we can give to the world and when we're talking about sustainable business? The first is wisdom. It's a God-given gift, but we can nurture it and serve others to think through deeply what are the implications of the impact of our business in our world. How do we minimize the negatives, maximize the positives? Second, innocence. That questioning mindset that is a wellspring of curiosity and exploration. We need that if we're going to tackle these big problems. So wise as serpents and innocent as doves. The third is understanding. As Christians, we should have this pastorally rooted desire to understand context before we make decisions. And boy, do we need to understand the world before we start trying to tackle these really big issues. Fourth, global. A love for all people and a concern for all creation, wherever it might be, because so many of these issues, whether it's international supply chains and businesses or climate change, are truly global. And I think a rounded Christian view takes a global view. Transformative. As Christians, we believe in the possibility of transformation, a belief that radical transformation is possible because we live in God's world under God's authority. We also, I think, as Christians, are capable of taking a systematic view. We see the complexity, we see the connection, we reflect the fullness of Scripture and the mystery of God, and we hold them together and say, how do we make this system better? And lastly, thinking about prophecy, thinking about a consideration of what our actions today might be for the future of the world tomorrow. So there we are. We've covered 3 things together, and apologies for going slightly over time, got carried away. We've talked about ethics, we've talked about purpose, and we've talked about that distinctive Christian contribution. But I'd love to hear challenges, questions, observations as we break out into our groups, and any questions that folks have for me.
Duncan Lawrence Evans here. Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
And it actually comes back to your interesting point about balance and being prophetic. And I think for me, a lot of the environmentalism trades on fears and scare tactics. We have to care for the world because it's a burning bridge, it's all we've got, and it's going up in a basket. And while there are some elements of truth in that, I think we have a much more hopeful view potentially of environmentalism and sustainability, which is that there is a better world we can build it, we can care for it, but ultimately God has a better and bigger plan that goes even beyond this world to a new heaven and a new earth. So how would you reframe the Christian worldview of sustainability that goes beyond fear tactics?
Yeah, well, it's a great question, Lawrence, and I won't be able to answer it fully, but perhaps I can start sketching out something that may be useful. And I think if we frame it in a scriptural perspective, starting with the Garden of Eden and ending with the New Jerusalem, it seems to me there's something incredibly powerful about this vision, which is God's heart is for the created order, but also what human beings have created within the world. So we don't return to Genesis and the Garden of Eden. We return to a vision of a New Jerusalem where the tree are there with the leaves for the healing of all nations. It is this beautiful vision of an urban environment, namely one that human hands have crafted, that God is blessing, and nature is there right in the center with the river flowing and the trees are there. So I think, as you are suggesting, Lawrence, that there is an aspect of Christian, something which we should seek to avoid is being peddlers of fear. On the other hand, Lawrence, I want to also say that this is true in the secular world, that there are huge debates about, how do you do this well to motivate people? And we know that people are motivated by different things. And so there are some really interesting debates taking place amongst theologians about whether sort of prophecy, hope, or lament are the most powerful aspects to explore sustainable environmental topics. My own view is that we need the full resources of our faith, and therefore we need prophecy, we need lament, and we need hope. I think if we just peddle hope and say, hey, it's all going to be fine, we diminish the gifts that God has given us. If we all say, woe is us, we're all doomed, we misunderstand our faith profoundly.
Any other question? I like the linking of lament leading to hope.
Could I ask a
Mike?
question? Thank you. I'm struck by the things you've got there, but it seems very about our own country in many ways. And I just wonder, in terms of the whole thing on sustainability and our responsibility as Christians, to what extent should we be thinking about Matthew 25:31 onwards, where it talks about separating the goats from the sheep, and our responsibility for people in the developing world who are in such plight?
Yeah, well, first off, thanks, Mike, for the question. And if it feels very UK-centric, apologies for that, because it's really not meant to. Clearly, major businesses, and they tend to be my clients, are located in the developed world. That goes without saying. However, the clients I work with every day, I was on a call at 6 a.m. this morning with a family business in Japan. I'm speaking to Toyota in Japan. So lots of North American, lots of Europe. But it's absolutely fair to say that I do not have clients, frankly, because they can't afford me, in developing countries. And I don't mean that rudely. I mean that as a symptom of the separation and the inequality that exists. So how do we, think really deeply and really carefully? I think that there is no contradiction in seeing power and responsibility coming together, in profound ways. So if we are talking about, let's just take Toyota as an example. In the next 20 years, the biggest transformation in the automotive sector and in large parts of the sectors is going to be the electrification and move away from fossil fuels to electrification. That means more batteries. What do more batteries mean? They mean more rare earth metals. Where do rare earth metals come from? China, Democratic Republic of Congo, and other developing nations, where human rights issues are tragically problematic. And so if you're a responsible company, your opportunity to influence and to say, we're really going to do something profound here, is really important. So that's the power and responsibility view, where responsibility and power can flow positively into that context. The other, of course, is from a Christian perspective, as well as a business leader's perspective, is always being open to listening. It's that point about understanding context, that context being both a global context, because supply chains are global, but also the specific sorts of context in which you operate. And we find that a lot of the time with companies we work with. Let's just take an example around diversity and inclusion. And I noticed on the chat when we talked about Chick-fil-A, they've gotten a pickle over issues to do with sexual identity and gay marriage. But in other markets that we operate in, when you're wanting to talk about diversity and inclusion strategies in a business, you cannot assume a one-size-fits-all, because if your business is operating in Uganda or Saudi Arabia or Hungary or France, there are legislative barriers or to action, or in South Africa, there are particular requirements to act in certain ways. So I hope, Mike, what's coming across is, yes, a big global view, but a deep concern for everybody made in the image of God, combined with that cultural and understanding of context that we listen to, as well as seeking to positively impact through the power we possess.